Hi friends, in today's video I want to give you 5 reasons why the Nikon ZF is the best camera in the world for adapting vintage lenses. That's correct, you heard me right. The Nikon ZF is hands down the best digital camera for adapting lenses in the history of digital cameras. It's not hyperbole, it's not debatable. You could try, but you won't win. It's the absolute truth, and I'm going to tell you why. But also, a special treat for those who watch till the end, I will give you some examples of some photos that I've been able to capture with 2 of my favorite vintage lenses on this device over the past couple months. And those lenses would be the Nikon 24mm f2 AIS and the 50mm 1.4 AIS lens. But we'll come back to those. But first, reason number 1, look at it. Seriously, just look at it. Obvious, right? Have you ever seen a more perfect object attached to a vintage lens? It's absolute vintage perfection. The look, the feel, the tactile experience, putting that vintage lens on most other mirrorless cameras would create an incongruous experience where the sleek stylings and boring, non-labeled continuous dials wouldn't match what's happening up here. It's the opposite of a mullet, business at the back, party in the front. But with Nikon ZF, we get party everywhere. One complaint I have had with Nikon ZF when using normal Z glass is that you don't get an aperture dial. You get that, you just have to use the dial, the continuous dial, which is a vestige of modern, boring mirrorless or DSLR style, and I really hate that. But when you've got a vintage lens attached, you get the full experience, that full manual aperture on a vintage lens in a vintage experience. I say vintage a lot in this video, but it brings it all together for the Nikon ZF for me. So some might argue, though, that the Fuji bodies and the Fuji lenses provide that out the gate. You do have that experience that I'm talking about. It's consistent. And you would be absolutely right, but here's where we get into the second reason why the ZF is better, and that is that there aren't any modern digital cameras, least of which Fuji, that provide that vintage experience in a full frame body. With Fuji, we get those vintage style camera bodies in APS-C format. And when you have lenses designed for 35mm film and you want to put them on a camera with a APS-C sensor, you take a quality hit. You only use a portion of the image circle, which they were designed to accommodate. And not only that, but the vintage lenses are already weak in one particular area, and this is the next reason, and that is the wide angle area. Let me show you an example. With this lens, this is the, like I said, the Nikon 24mm f2 lens. I thoroughly love this lens, particularly when shooting it wide open. I love the quality of bokeh and the wide angle field of view when I'm shooting up close on subjects. It's not so hot when you're shooting at the narrower apertures, when you're stopping it down. But that's not why I purchased this lens, and I don't use it for architecture. I'll show you some examples of that just to be thorough, but I usually use it for up close projects and subjects in documentary settings, and it does so well in those settings. But when I mount this to my Fuji devices, which I have done plenty, that beautiful 24mm angle of view goes up to a 35mm field of view, and that to me is a total waste. So for wide angle vintage glass, which like I said is pretty rare and unusual usually, especially with a small aperture, the ZF really is the perfect camera. Now the next few reasons are not unique to the Nikon ZF. Other mirrorless cameras and devices will have these features, but we need to talk about them because it's the combination of those with the factors I've already mentioned that combine to make the perfect camera for adapting. And that next reason is flange distance. If you look at vintage cameras of any kind, you'll see that there's a very wide gap between where the film plane is and the mount, the lens mount, and we call that the flange distance. But on mirrorless cameras, particularly with Nikon Z, that distance is very, very narrow. So when we compare this to its competition, say Leica and Panasonic, those mirrorless offerings that they have, full frame mirrorless offerings, they've got a 20 millimeter flange distance. Canon also has a 20 millimeter flange distance with the Canon R. Sony has an 18 millimeter flange distance, but Nikon Z comes in ahead with only 16 millimeter flange distance. What that means is, of all of the camera brands, this is the most likely to support all the different flange distances of different vintage camera bodies. So there are some that go further into the camera than others. That means the Nikon Z is more likely to support those. So it's a small thing, but it matters. So in addition to flange distance, and I'd call this next reason number 4, though it's a small reason, mount diameter. Because the mount diameter is so large on Nikon Z, it means that mounting lenses with really large image circles, like medium format lenses, are going to work slightly better because they're more supported. Whereas if I was to put those same lenses on something with a smaller diameter lens mount, there'd be a lot more weight and it wouldn't be as distributed as well. And it wouldn't be, I don't know. It's a reason, okay? Where was I? Finally, the Nikon ZF represents the very best sensor stabilization that it's on par with modern mirrorless sensor stabilizations at full frame, which 5 stops of image stabilization is what we got these days. Sony has some newer ones that they claim to give you a 0.5 addition to that, but for all intents and purposes, we're on par with the best sensor stabilization that you can get for full frame. Micro Four Thirds can give you more, but that's because they're smaller and there's more room to work with to provide stabilization. But having the capability to shoot with vintage glass in a vintage way, but using a modern stabilization on a full frame body where you would normally need a tripod or where you would have to crank the ISO up normally, that's incredible. But when you combine all those factors, image stabilization, focus peaking, we didn't mention focus peaking, that's a thing, obviously. That's not unique to the ZF. Everyone has that, but it's important for adapting lenses. Flange distance, like we said, the fact that it has a truly vintage design and style and shooting experience, as you would have had in the film era. And all this on a full frame device, like I said, with, by the way, an absolute gorgeous 24.5 megapixel BSI CMOS sensor, with those beautiful Nikon colors, which I believe are the most pleasant right out of camera over any other camera brand. Still love Fuji colors, don't get me wrong, but I do believe that Nikon has the most accurate, the most beautiful colors straight out of camera. When you combine all of those factors, it's the best. And if you are not convinced, I'd love to hear your reasons why in the comments. But as for me, as of January 30th, 2024, the Nikon ZF is, without question, the absolute best platform for adapting vintage lenses in the history of all cameradom. And I want to show you some photographic evidence of that with some photos that I've recently taken with this combination, like I said, also with the 50mm Nikon 1.4 lens. But before we do that, I want to tell you where these beautiful lenses came from, and that is from this video's sponsor, KEH.com. KEH.com is the ultimate destination for buying and selling used photography gear, including an incredible selection of vintage lenses. It's where I go when I'm looking to add any new gems to my collections, where I went to buy these ones. At KEH, they understand the value of trust, especially when it comes to vintage gear. Every lens goes through a rigorous inspection and grading process, ensuring you know exactly what you're going to get. No unpleasant surprises, just pure photographic bliss. You will also find that KEH.com has the deepest stock of vintage lenses anywhere, and they'll probably have what you're looking for. The Nikon 24mm f2 AIS is an example. It's a fairly rare lens, but it is currently in stock at KEH and in a couple different conditions. And that's another thing I love about KEH, by the way, is that you can choose the condition depending on your budget. And in my experience, even ugly at KEH.com means that it's in good enough condition for anything I need, as opposed to other platforms where ugly might mean unusable. So head on over to KEH.com and start exploring their treasure trove of vintage lenses, and use my discount code on the screen now or in the description for 5% off your next purchase. So that's all the talking I'm going to do for now. I'll now let the photos do some talking as I show you some of the imagery that I've captured with the 2 lenses that I mentioned on this device over the past couple months. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoy the imagery I'm about to show you. Remember to do good with your camera, and we'll talk to you again real soon.
He's a tough man. Since he knows our secret, He has to be killed.